Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So as we were talking about earlier, we are in the midst in this part of California where I live and where many of you who are online today live, in which we are having a lot of smoke from an unusually bad fire season this year, 2020. And there have been days when the sky was very orange and dark, hard to see the sun even during the day, especially in the Bay Area. And people who are impacted in terms of their health, right? Because of the smoke, because of the ash that's in the air. And I want to say, when I noticed many of these people taking photos and describing this situation, whether it's online this way or in other kinds of social media, and talking about their experience of it, and there's a very deep sense of uneasiness. Either it's sometimes expressed as a kind of sadness or sometimes expressed as a kind of anxiety that comes from this, right? Our primitive mind looks at the sky like that and smells the air like that and knows that that's not healthy for us, knows that it shouldn't be like that, or thinks that it shouldn't be like that. It must be because the conditions are there for it to be like that, but nonetheless, there's a part of us that knows that that's harmful, that that's not good. And it's a very low level part of us, right? It goes to, I would say, very basically to the feeling tone of the experience. So when I did the guided meditation today, you notice that we were focusing on the sense perceptions, the perception of smell, for example, right? Or the perception of visual stimulation, sights, and whether they are pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And so when we have an unpleasant feeling tone with whatever sense object that we're contacting, then that is expressed by the mind as a kind of perception that ties into our perception of the thing, right? So the perception is that this is unhealthy, or the perception is that this is strange, or unsafe, or various other ways that we think about it. And that is a very, very strong, very compelling part of the mind. The feeling tones and these kind of very low level, sort of primitive understandings of phenomena are very compelling. They tend to drive our responses, particularly when we're not aware of them, right? The feeling tone can very much drive our responses and our reactions to what's happening in the world. So typically we feel attracted to a positive feeling tone, we feel aversive to a negative feeling tone, right? And we feel typically confused or not interested in a neutral feeling tone, one that's neither positive nor negative. But what to do in a situation like that? What to do in a situation where the environment itself brings up a strong negative Vedana. Vedana is the Pali word for this feeling tone. How to practice with that, how to live with that. So, to give it a little context, what I'd like to do is talk today a little bit about the four foundations of mindfulness, about the Satipatthana. So, the four foundations are the mindfulness of body, mindfulness of feeling tones, mindfulness of mind, and mindfulness of Dhammas. So again, maybe I'm going to start from the point of saying perhaps you have experienced some of the mindfulness of body and seen the effects, smelled what's going on, noticed how there's a reaction or response in the physical. Then you notice perhaps that there's a unpleasantness or a aversion to that, or a sadness that comes out of that, some kind of negative mental perception and mental state. But the mind itself, when we talk about mindfulness of mind, so having grounded ourselves in the body and grounded ourselves in the understanding of the feeling tone, mindfulness of mind is not so much about the perceptions themselves or the thoughts as much as it is about the greater context of mind. So that's why in the meditation we were looking at that sixth sense, mind as a sense realm or as a sense door, and mental activity as phenomena or sensations happening within that, meeting that sense realm or that sense door. And so right away, just hearing that description, you might notice that, as I was trying to point out in the meditation, there is a knowing part of the mind, and that knowing part of the mind is looking at, another part of the mind is looking at the activity or the thoughts or that feeling tone, that negative undertone, right? So these are both aspects of mind, and sometimes I think of it as setting up a kind of uh, skillful duality. It's setting up a constructed duality of one part of the mind looking at another part of the mind. And that is a very helpful thing to do. It shows us many things, but for one, it begins to show you that thoughts themselves can be treated in a different way, right? Thoughts are like a sound or like a smell. They're not going to be around forever. So there's a little bit more spaciousness about the response to thought as phenomena. A little bit more choice, perhaps, about the response to thought as phenomena. And it also shows the way in which we have tendencies of the mind. We have kind of a groove that the mind will get in, right? So the habitual states of the mind, the Buddha said, which we know actually now from are confirmed by various kinds of studies and neuroscience and so on. The habitual tendencies of the mind tend to get stronger and stronger. Right? If you focus on negative perception, then the mind has a tendency to stay over and over again with negative perception. It takes more effort to see the positive. Physically, the mind is actually responding to that, is actually constructing itself around those habits, those tendencies. And so also having a look at thoughts as sensation or thoughts as phenomena, sometimes it can be easier to perceive patterns in the way of our thinking. To begin to see those tendencies or those habits or those repetitions. Sometimes you might experience the mind as being like a dog with a bone, right? Like not letting go. We're just going to chew and chew and chew and chew and chew on a particular issue over and over again. And sometimes when that happens, it feels like one thought is around for a long time. But if we are mindful, if we are paying very close attention to the mind and to the context, to the very subtle layers of the experience, we can see that that is a repetition over and over and over again. That thoughts actually, generally speaking, have a very short lifespan. But there's even more that can be unfolding here. And for that, I want to bring in this poem of Mittakali Bhikkhuni. So by now, most of you, if not all of you, are aware that we here at Aloka Vihara have been teaching from the first Free Women, Maddie Weingast's, rendering or interpretation of the poems of the Teris, the enlightened women of the Buddha's time. And in particular, I want to talk about Venerable Mittakali Bhikkhuni, Venerable Mittakali Teri. Mittakali. She's, if you're following along in the book, she's on page 56. So Mittakali, so her name means friend of the dark. Friend of the dark. And she was, just to tell a little bit about her story, she was from a Brahmin family. So she was from the upper social strata in India of that time, the Indian caste system of that time. And she actually came into the monastic life early as a young woman. And she tells us this, she gives us this poem which tells a little bit of her story. So I'll share this with you and we'll talk about what she's pointing at. She says, I was always smart. If the path was good, path with a capital P, the path, the Noble Eightfold Path, if the path was good, I figured it would make me even smarter. One night while meditating, I watched my thoughts piling themselves up all around me. My mind built a house out of all those thoughts and then filled that house. Soon it was a whole city, a whole world. Oh, my beautiful, beautiful thoughts, who will look after you after I'm gone? I swear I could weep for all of you. My sisters, she says, her sisters in the spiritual life. My sisters, do you really want to be free? A question that we would all do well to ask ourselves. Do we really want to be free? Are you ready, she asks, to leave behind all your precious little houses and make your home everywhere? It's not as hard as you might think. First stand up and then walk out the door. So I'd like to unpack this a little bit. She starts out by saying, I was always smart and I thought that if the Dhamma was good, it would make me even smarter. Mm. So she's talking about a path of accumulation, a path of accumulation of knowledge, of learning. And certainly that's part of the path, is to take up the Dhamma that's presented in talks and later on in texts. But ultimately the path is not like that. It is not about an accumulation of anything, actually. It's about a relinquishment of all that stands between you and wisdom. When you look at the attainments, what we call the attainments, the various stages, the various kinds of insights that people have, it's insights into a kind of experience that allows whole blocks of delusion to drop off. So this idea that the Dhamma would make her smarter is a little bit off, right? Her motivation is a little bit off here. And yet it's okay. It's really okay. Because if you come to the path and you engage wholeheartedly in the path as it's described by the Buddha, it will transform you. It will show you the nature of this body and mind. It has that tendency. Because this body and mind, why is it that we can say that? Because this body and mind is naturally expressing those very truths that we are trying to discover. Right? It's natural expression of those very truths. And so for this reason, when the Buddha spoke to the Kalamas, for example, so the Kalamas were people in India who lived in a part of the world where there were lots of spiritual teachers coming and going. And they were all trashing each other's teachings. They would come through and they would say, oh, that person, what they said, that's not really true. That's all wrong. What I say is right, and it should be like this. And so they asked the Buddha, they said, how to make sense of this? And he said, well, of course, this is a perplexing thing. This is a good question that you ask. And he said very clearly to them, do not go by reasoning. This is a sutta that's very often misquoted. So this is why I'm sharing it with you. He said, don't go by logic or by reasoning or by texts or by lineage or by somebody who's a good speaker. But actually, he said, when the wise give you, when there are wise people in the world that give you some practice and you try that practice and you see that it is for your welfare, for your peace and happiness of mind, then you do that. This is from the Anguttara Threes. It's a very, very beautiful teaching. It's a very interesting teaching. And it often gets misquoted as the Buddha saying, oh, you can just decide for yourself what's the right practice. But the Buddha said, actually, you can only understand the right practice by having tried it, by having done it. So first, though, you need to use your discernment about what's wise. And so in a way, it's also the Buddha saying to us that you're not going to be able to analyze your way through the path, but that there is a resonance. The wisdom in us has a resonance with the wisdom in the world. And we can try that out and see for ourselves whether we're right, whether we're resonating with what's actually helpful and wholesome, or not. So for this reason, Mittakali makes a shift right after she says she thought that the path would make her even smarter. But then she tells us about the path, what the path actually did for her, which wasn't about smarter. She says, oh, I was meditating and I watched my thoughts piling themselves up around me. Hmm? Very interesting. So this is that constructed separation, right? This is the knowing. There's the one watching, and there's the thoughts piling up. Do you see how she's describing very clearly this meditation on mind as a sense object? Or you could say mindfulness of mind. She's describing it very clearly. So the observing mind is not the thoughts themselves. But then she goes on to say, okay, so using this knowing mind, this observing mind, and seeing the thoughts piling up, she starts to discern this pattern, right? This bigger picture. And the thoughts are doing what? They are building a house. Building a house. And what is this house? This house is the sense of self. These walls of the sense of self and the sense of separation between what we perceive to be me and what we perceive to be other. Building up these big walls in the mind. And then it filled that house with all kinds of ideas, all kinds of identities, all kinds of attachments and desires, and desire for things, desire for not things. Soon it was a whole city and a whole world. So describing the way perhaps in which we not only construct a sense of self out of the thoughts that come and go, but then we also decide on whether the world is okay for that self. And we divide everything up into the inner and the outer, the okay, the mine and the not mine. Right? Filling the house with things and then finding a whole world outside of that. And the Buddha mentions this. It's actually interesting about this reference of the house builder. Maybe some of you are familiar with that. It's mentioned in the Dhammapada also as one of the things that the Buddha said shortly after his awakening. He said, house builder, I see you. You will build the house no more. Right? The ridge pole, the pole that holds up the house, is broken. So this is interesting. It's an interesting metaphor. Whether Mittakali knew this was a metaphor that the Buddha had used, or whether this was also a metaphor that just described her experience, and she verbalized this poem as a way of describing it in a similar fashion to what the Buddha had done. But either way, it says something about the construction, the way that we use our thoughts. And then again, she makes another pivot and she says something about what happened after she learned that, after she was able to see that. And then she says, oh, my beautiful thoughts, who will look after you when I'm gone? Right? So she's relinquished her attachment to those thoughts. Those thoughts won't have anybody to take care of them if there's not a house builder anymore. Those thoughts of the sense of separation, of the sense of building the house, of the sense of things that are not me, and the things that belong to me, and so on. And notice that she's not talking about a blank mind. Even after this awakening, she's not talking about a blank mind or a mind that doesn't have thoughts. And she's also not talking about a mind that is just pure wholesome thoughts. It's all sorts of thoughts, right? Because even the wholesome thoughts will be relinquished ultimately for peace, in the name of peace. So she says, I could weep for all of you because I'm giving you up. I'm giving up all of those thoughts of building a sense of self. And then she asks us this question that I said we could also ask ourselves: do we really want to be free? Are we ready to leave behind our houses? It's a good question. I would suggest that we have to practice. We have to practice for quite a while in order to be ready to do such a thing. To find ourselves at home everywhere, as she says. Imagine that, the spaciousness of that. Making our home everywhere. Even in a world that is on fire. Even in a world that is confused. Even in a heart and mind that perhaps is still building those walls. We're still able to be present with that mind. And so classically, if we look at the Satipatthana, we see that the mindfulness of mind was described by the Buddha there as moving from this examination of mind of these more gross states to the more subtle states, and keeping in mind that the word that we're using here for mind is chitta, the Pali word chitta, which is sometimes translated as heart as well, right? It's all of our cognitive states, including emotions and analysis and all kinds of things. Shin in Japanese and in Chinese. So the Buddha says we examine, first of all, the mind that is affected by raga, dosa, and moha. So the mind of greed, anger, and delusion, or lust and hatred and delusion is how they're sometimes translated. So the mind that is with the kilesa, with the defilements or the poisons, is how they're referred to often in Zen. Defilements usually in the Theravada. And that word defilements, I'm not so very fond of it, but I have to say it does imply subtly one aspect of those, which is that they are not intrinsic to the mind, not as the Buddha described it. The Buddha said that those to leave behind, it was possible. That is, in fact, the very definition of nibbana that he uses in certain places. Possible to completely leave behind great hatred and delusion. So in the Satipatthana, it says, we observe the mind that has lust and the mind that does not have lust. And we observe the mind that has greed and the mind that does not have greed, and the mind that has delusion, or rather, the greed and the lust are the same one. I'm sorry, I'm getting tired. The greed, the anger, and the delusion, with and without those states. And so I want to say both of those two things are very important. Sometimes it can get very easy to get hung up on seeing the defilements, to see those poisons in the mind. But then there's the other practice, which is to notice when they are absent. This is a very important part of the study of mindfulness of mind, right? To notice when greed is absent, or when hatred or anger is absent, or to notice when confusion is absent. And why is that important? Well, for one reason, for one fact, because that is something that we can rejoice in. We can actually enjoy the mind that is free from those things, even momentarily. You know, Venerable Analayo has written these lovely books on the Satipatthana, and let's see if I can find. He wrote this very pithy little poem about this particular aspect, and let's see if I can find it quickly here, which I really enjoyed, and because he puts a lot of emphasis actually on finding joy in the practice, right? Working with the natural tendency of mind to lean toward, to be interested in states that are pleasant, right? So he says, such joy it can be when the mind is free, even if only temporarily. Such joy it can be when the mind is free, even if only temporarily. Hmm? So we don't even need to add joy, right? There is just a pleasantness about the mind that is not colored by those states. And the interesting thing is for us to find the mind that is colored by those states or not colored by those states without getting too caught up in the thoughts themselves. So I'll give you a good example of this. A good example of this is I say to myself, that in previous days, not recently, I say to myself, you know, I want something. I want something. And I go and I stand in front of the refrigerator and I go, what do I want? I don't want the cheese. Do I want some water? Nah, not really. Am I even hungry? Not really. You know, but there's this wanting, right? There's this low level, or perhaps not so low level, because I'm standing there in front of the refrigerator, right? Desire, greed for something. And I haven't even given it an object yet. So I'm standing in front of the refrigerator looking for an object for that desire. Do you see what I'm saying? It's a very interesting phenomena. Maybe this happens for you with other things. Maybe it's not the refrigerator. Uh, but there can be this sense of the the greed, the stickiness of greed, or the resistance and and negativity of anger, right? And the kind of fogginess of delusion, independent of the thoughts, right? The kind of larger container of the thoughts can have these kinds of flavors. So to be sure, we should be careful with our terminology. So I tend to think of the third satipatthana as being the sort of attributes or characteristics of mind. Mindfulness of mind is about ascertaining the attribute of mind. And then the fourth satipatthana, which is dhammas, which is the hindrances and the 7 factors of awakening, typically at a minimum, if depending on which one of the versions you're looking at, as being mind states. Venerable Analayo often talks about the third satipatthana, the one we're talking about now, the mindfulness of mind, as being examining mind states, and those other ones as being specific types of mind states. So I don't want to confuse you all, But I don't like to use the word mind states for this third one because of that, because I don't want you, I want us to think about the mind in this much more broad way than a particular state, like um, like joy, for example, is even a little bit more specific than the kinds of mind we're looking at here. So going then to the more subtle layer, so those are the more gross layers. That's so the Buddha, as he often does, is giving us a series of observations, a series of pointers. In Buddhism, it's very easy to think of it in terms of lists. So we have a list about this and we have a list about that. But actually, the way that I want to suggest is that what the Buddha did was he gave us specific phenomena to look at. He says, oh, first look at this, and then we look at this, and then we look at this, and then we look at this. So he's given us not a to-do list, but a, a sort of description of the facets of the jewel, different facets through which we can see the mind. So the other, after looking at the poisons and or the lack thereof, then we can look at whether the mind is contracted or not and distracted or not. Mm. And contracted mind, again, might be very familiar in the state where we are having this kind of negative feeling tone from the environment, right? There's a kind of pulling in, there's a kind of wanting to withdraw from that phenomena, wanting to withdraw from those sense perceptions. This kind of literal, sometimes if you observe the mind that way, you can see a kind of literal like darkness or a kind of literal shutting down within the luminosity of mind. That kind of contractedness. So sometimes contracted can be related to fear. Sometimes contracted can be related to sadness. Um, yeah, yeah. Or anger, that the mind can get very tight and contracted around anger, or challenge, when the ego self is challenged, when that house, somebody's challenging your house. Very contracted mind. Or more open, right? More open, more flexible, more pliable mind. And then distracted or scattered mind. And so now this is a very tricky one. Think about this. So if you are observing the distracted, scattered mind, then how to stay steady observing the scattered mind, right? This is a very, very one. Now you start to see the subtlety that the Buddha is asking us to do in the mindfulness of mind. So one way to do that is that, as we've said before, so you ground it in the body, right? You're grounded in the body, and you're observing the feeling tone so as not to get swept away by the feeling tone. And you see this way in which the mind has the tendency to flit to one thing or another. But the seeing mind, that knowing mind, that observing mind, is just sitting still and watching that. A while back, a long time ago, I was listening to a talk by Gil Fronsdal, and he was describing something like sitting on the bank of the river and watching these boats go by. And so one boat was like indignation over social justice issues, and one boat was, relationship and love, and one boat was, and so being able to observe the mind going, wanting to go and get on that boat, he said. There's a mind that wants to go and get on that boat. Oh, that boat's kind of fun. They have music and they have lots of loud sounds, and look how angry they are. That sounds really exciting, right? And you could get pulled off into that. But no, but the practice is you're sitting on the bank and you're observing those boats and not getting pulled in, but just noticing that going out, right? And again, one of the very natural tendencies of mind, it's not that we are trying to judge that there's something wrong with that, but there is a very natural tendency of mind often to be out there scanning, particularly when we're feeling fearful, particularly when we're feeling that negative Vedana, right? There can be a kind of wariness, a kind of scanning all the time. But to settle at being able to see that, then it will naturally lose some of its energy, right? This is something that you can observe very clearly in the mind. That thoughts and that kind of scatteredness of mind and so on, when we simply have the knower be steady enough to observe that, that already is taking some of the wind out of the sails of those boats. And at this point, I want to share a quote from Ajahn Chah. Ajahn Chah gave us this beautiful quote about this part of observing the mind. He says, "The mind is not peaceful because it follows moods. But the mind's true nature is none of those things. Gladness or sadness is not the mind, but only a mood coming to deceive us. Really, this mind of ours is already unmoving and peaceful." Just this is the aim of all this practice we put ourselves through. Just this meaning to get in touch with that mind that is steady and peaceful enough to see that the mood is not the mind itself, is not the whole of the mind, is not the whole of who you are even in that moment. And then just to wrap it up, so then the Buddha goes on to these even more subtle states of observation. The exalted or great mind. These are in the commentaries. This term is associated with the jhanas, although it can also be perhaps thought of as a kind of magnanimous or very, very vast, very, very vast states of mind. And then the unsurpassed or the surpassed mind. So in the commentaries, this is the immaterial jhanas, the 5th through the 8th. But again, also possible to think about those as being very, very subtle experiences of that stability, that stillness and peaceful mind that Ajahn Chah is pointing us to. And then there's concentrated or not, and liberated or not. Although at this stage of Satipatthana, we would not take that liberated to mean fully liberated, but temporarily liberated from the poisons, from the defilements. So I guess what I'm pointing out, just to try to wrap it up here, and then we'll move into some question and answer. I guess what I'm pointing at here is to say that when there is an experience of the feeling tone, this very pervasive negative feeling tone, because of the environment that we're in, then the unobserved mind will simply click over from that negative feeling tone into a reactivity and a negative perception and a fear and a thought process that gets more and more entangled in itself, more and more reactive. swept along, just swept along with that feeling tone, and identified with the thoughts so strongly that there isn't a kind of choice about how to respond to them, but there's just a reactivity over and over again happening, usually repetitive reactivity, right? And so the alternative that the Buddha offers is to step back into the knowing mind, step back into the observing mind, and allow that sense of separation, which again is constructed, but allow that sense of separation of seeing different aspects of mind with another part of mind to give us enough spaciousness to be more responsive, to have more choice, to not be so swept away by the underlying tone, to be able to notice perhaps the thought patterns and how those patterns are working, but then notice as well that there is an overall context, an overall mind, which is context for that, which can hold that steadily, peacefully. If we are willing, if we are willing to have a look at those thoughts and to understand that there's more to the mind than that. Thank you so much for your time this evening and your attention.